Welcome again. My name is Angelica Gloria Velasco with the CPUC's Energy Division. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Electrification Impact Study, Part 2, Draft Results Workshop. Before we get started, I'll briefly cover some ground rules and logistics. Today's workshop is being recorded. All attendees will remain muted by default. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand function, and one of our hosts will unmute you. If you prefer to type your question, please submit through the chat. Energy Division staff will read the questions out loud or invite you to speak. When speaking, please remember to identify yourself and your organization. We also ask that you stay on topic, that be respectful of other speakers, and avoid repeating questions already asked. Here's today's agenda. We'll begin with a brief recap of day 1, followed by Southern California Edison's presentation of their draft results. After SE's session, we'll transition into stakeholder Q&A. And we will close the workshop with final remarks and next steps from Energy Division. With that, let's start with the quick recap. Yesterday, we began with opening remarks by Commissioner Hauk, followed by Energy Division's overview of the study's purpose and its role in high DER proceeding. As a reminder, EIS Part 2 fulfills the load flexibility distribution planning process assessment required in Decision 2410-030 and will directly inform future DPP cycles in the form of scenario planning, equity requirements, and econometrics and forecasting improvements. We then reviewed the required scenario design for this study. The base case using the 2023 IEPR forecast, the equity scenario that scales electrification in priority populations, and the enhanced demand flexibility scenario that reflects additional load management and flexibility potential. Following the framing, SDG&E presented their draft results. They walked us through their 3-scenario modeling approach, primary and secondary system methodologies, and their assumptions for forecasting, equity allocation, and demand flexibility. SDG&E also discussed their projected grid needs, mitigation strategies, and high-level cost outcomes for 2030 and 2040. After lunch, PG&E presented their draft results. They provided a deep overview of their geospatial adoption modeling, load impact modeling, and their distribution solutioning process across primary and secondary systems. They also shared key findings, including total investment ranges across scenarios, the role of demand flexibility in reducing peak load and infrastructure needs, and the expanded scope of secondary analysis in EIS Part 2. PG&E also highlighted how equity-driven electrification changes adoption patterns and the resulting impacts on capacity upgrades. Then we closed the day with a preview of procedural next steps, including the December 15 deadline for stakeholder comments and the January 28 day deadline for final IOU reports. Overall, Day 1 just provided a detailed look at the study framework, and the preliminary results were SDG&E and PG&E. With that, we'll now begin Day 2 with Southern California Edison's presentation. SE, could you please let me know when you are ready?
Hi, Angelica. This is Ari from SCE. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. We have a number of speakers, obviously, because we do have an extended talk today. So I'm just going to give folks a sense of who's going to be speaking on behalf of SCE. We have Ann Tran, who's a senior engineer in grid policy and system planning and engineering. He's joined by his colleague Ricky, also an engineer on that team. We also have Brent, who will be speaking for our forecasting team, as there are significant forecasting elements in our EIS. And I should just state that this was a tremendous team effort. The work product you're going to see today over the next few hours was produced by over a dozen team members, and of course over practically a year of work. So you'll be hearing three speakers, but it is truly the work of a tremendously broad team of experts here at SCE, and we do appreciate the opportunity to share this work with you. So if you could turn to the next page, and Helika, you'll be running the slides for us?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes, I
okay.
will.
Great. I'll just quickly go over the agenda, and then I'll turn it over to Ann Tran, who will be the first uh, subject matter expert to speak. We'll be going over the objective and scope of our study over the next 10 minutes. Then we'll quickly jump into conclusions and our scenario results. Then we'll look at our findings and recommendations. We'll hear about our forecast methodology. As I stated, we do have Brent from our forecasting team. And then we'll look at grid needs and mitigation methodology. And finally, we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. And I just want to also note that there may be some differences here in SCE's results and conclusions versus what you heard from the other two IOUs yesterday. And that is because we do have a different service territory and we did use maybe slightly different methodologies. So please keep that in mind, and we'll try to highlight differences and when we get to our conclusions. And of course, if you have questions about that, we'll be happy to talk to you about that during the Q&A, because we did work closely with the other two IUs, and we have a fairly good sense of what they found and where the differences lie. So we'll do our best if you do have questions on that. So if we can turn to the next slide, I think we'll be ready to turn this over to Ann Tran. Ann, are you available? I think you
Yes,
are.
thanks, Ari.
Great.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining SCE's EIS2 stakeholder workshop. Again, my name is Ann Tran, and I'm a senior engineer at SCE on the grid policy team within the system planning and engineering organization. So I'll be kicking us off. This effort has been underway for a couple of years now, dating back to 2023, and we're finally excited to be able to share the results with everybody. So when we embarked on this EIS2 journey, Energy Division had set forth the objective of EIS2, along with the list of scenarios that were required for the study. The objective of EIS2 is to estimate the conceptual cost of upgrading the primary and secondary distribution grid to meet electrification needs under multiple scenarios for 2030 and 2040. SC developed a total of 4 scenarios. 3 of them were defined within ED's minimum requirements document in November of 2024. And then an additional one was added after SC's check-in number 2 in July 2025. So the first scenario is the base scenario, which serves as the business as usual scenario for us to be able to compare against scenarios 2, 3, and 4. We use the CEC's 2023 IEPR local reliability scenario, and the DR adoption pattern is consistent with how we performed this during our annual distribution planning process. The second scenario, the equity-driven scenario, compares an equity-driven DR adoption pattern against the base scenario and identified the incremental infrastructure upgrades and costs, given that there are policies and programs in place to enable this type of DR adoption pattern. And then SCE actually performed 2 demand flexibility scenarios. The initial demand flexibility scenario aims to identify the reduction in distribution upgrades by utilizing flexible loads to maximize that distribution capacity and then thus managing affordability. And then we also have an alternate demand flexibility scenario, which adjusts the participation rates from the prior demand flexibility scenario. And we adjust this for energy storage and electric vehicles to 100% participation. Next slide, please. So here's the scope of what was studied in EIS2 for SCE and what the outputs are. So SCE studied and included distribution substation needs, primary distribution feeder needs, and secondary distribution system needs. SCE identified upgrades and conceptual cost of new and expanded substations, new distribution feeders, distribution feeder upgrades, and secondary transformer service lines for all 4 scenarios. And lastly, the conceptual cost of upgrades will be based on unit cost used in SCE's 2025 GRC where available, and will be escalated to years 2030 and 2040 with the time horizons of, with those time horizons. All right, so now that we've set the stage, we'll actually be jumping directly into the resulting cost estimates from the 4 scenarios and the conclusions that we drew after completing the study. So the table on the left has the 4 scenarios for each row and the associated cost estimate for the 2030 and 2040 time horizons, which is inclusive of both the primary system and the secondary system. You'll see that the base scenario had a total in 2040 of $13.1 billion. So when we compared the equity scenario, we saw a cost estimate of 13.3 billion. So roughly 200 million more than the base scenario. And as a reminder, in the equity scenario, we added incremental DER adoption until that criteria was met. So overall, there was a net positive DER energy amount that was added in the equity scenario that drove more grid upgrades. And we'll get into how we developed that scenario in the later slides. And then we have our 2 demand flexibility scenarios. The initial demand flex scenario had a $12.8 billion cost, which is roughly a $300 million reduction when compared to the base. And then the alternate demand flex scenario saw $11.8 billion cost, so roughly $1.3 billion in reduction when we compare it to the base. So we'll get into the conclusions that we drew after seeing these results. So conclusion number 1, first off, studying the EIS2 scenarios actually gave us a lot of great insights into the potential grid needs that we would see in the future and the potential mitigation strategies that we deploy. But the equity scenario and the demand flex scenario aren't going to happen without any action. So we expect in the future that planning will include the appropriate DER adoption levels and demand flexibility when it's mature. Conclusion number 2, the equity scenario was quite interesting. It actually showed that when we prioritize DER adoption in disadvantaged communities, the number of projects or infrastructure needed to serve did not significantly increase. So it confirmed that we can provide equitable access to grid capacity without significant costs. And conclusion number 3, the demand flexibility scenarios showed some promise for deferring capital costs, which makes sense. However, we do need more evaluation to make sure it's reliable and cost effective before we begin including demand flexibility as a formal mitigation measure in our solution menu. Next slide, please. And one more. So scenario results. So now we can get into the scenario results and projects that were driven by these scenarios. So these tables here represent the total count of projects. The top table from 2025 to 2030, and the bottom table from 2025 to 2040. And so you'll see that the columns have each project type. The first 7 columns are associated with primary system upgrades, and then that last column for secondary system upgrades. We also set this table up to have the base scenario be represented with absolute value, the absolute value of the projects. And then the other scenarios that are listed underneath will have the delta when you compare to the base scenario as a reference. And so we put negative and positive signs for reference. So what's the takeaway here? There's a lot of work to be done in the distribution space over the next 15 years, that's for sure. But really, these results are more so what we expected to occur. Actually, I'll point out that there is an anomaly for the equity scenario when we look at the small distribution circuit upgrades, or DCU. There is a reduction there, but it's most likely because the small distribution upgrades were converted to larger distribution upgrades. So since that's the next project size. But overall, there are slight increases in project counts for the equity scenario, confirming that when we prioritize the adoption in disadvantaged communities, it again does not significantly increase the number of infrastructure needs. There is a slight reduction in project counts for both demand flexibility scenarios, with the alternate scenario having a larger magnitude reduction where we had higher participation assumptions. So let's look at an example here. So if we look at the bottom table for 2040 and look at the new circuit column, we see 464 circuits needed in the base scenario, with an increase of 6 new circuits in the equity scenario and a reduction in 29 new circuits in the initial demand flex scenario. There's a 73 new circuit reduction in the alternate demand flexibility scenario. So that's roughly like a 15% reduction in new circuits when we compare that to the base scenario. So this confirms that demand flexibility could significantly defer capital investments if it's proven to be reliable. I'll let folks digest on this slide a little bit. There is a lot of data here.
And Anne, I was thinking let me take this opportunity just to mention to folks that they can put questions in the chat, and we have a team working behind the scenes. And I see we do have one question. So give us a chance to take a look at this question, then Anne, we might suggest that you have a look as well. I know it's hard to multitask, present, and look at the questions. So we'll look at these questions and let you know, Anne, if we should try to break in and answer it right now or wait until the end. But yeah,
Sure.
thank you all. Thanks, Anne, and thanks everyone for using the chat for the questions to keep things organized.
All right, I think we can move on to the next slide here. So what does this mean for cost? So again, these tables are similarly set up to the previous slide, except this is in units of dollars, where the top table again is for the years 2025 to 2030, and the bottom table is for 2025 to 2040. So we see here that the majority of the cost differences come primarily from the primary system, with the primary cost in 2040 being 12.3 billion, and the secondary system cost at 884 million. And when we look at the total column through 2040, we see that 13.1 billion for the base, and then a 1.2% increase in the cost in the equity scenario, which confirms that the cost does not significantly raise overall if we prioritize the adoption in those disadvantaged communities. And then we see that significant reduction in cost for the alternate demand flexibility scenario at 10.4% reduction. Next slide, please. All right, so we'll get into our findings and recommendations here. So as part of the requirements for this study, the utilities were instructed to develop a plan for integration of demand flexibility learnings into the distribution planning and execution process. So here's what we believe it would take to make demand flexibility a real mitigation measure and a reality. So the demand flexibility scenarios in EIS2 showed that the high participation rates in the alternate scenario actually might be required. That level of participation might be required in order to have significant impacts to circuit peak loads. So this might suggest that demand flexibility may not yet be ready to be a dependable substitute for traditional infrastructure, and then highlights also the need for more research before integration. So some of the steps that we laid out here in order to get there. So first, demand flexibility is going to require significant customer participation and definitely real-time orchestration to really reduce those circuit peak loads. And that's why we need to study more to understand the bounds of what's achievable. Next, we'll need a comprehensive analysis through pilot programs. We think that these pilot programs will help us test flexibility solutions on circuits with high peak demand and a lot of potential for shifting those flexible loads. We'll need to define what flexible loads are and quantify their potential impact on each circuit. In order to rely on demand flexibility in our planning assumptions, we may need to adopt an over-enrollment strategy for flexible load capacity and figure out what the right incentive levels so that we can better understand the cost effectiveness of demand flexibility as a mitigation when we compare them to those traditional solutions. And if demand flexibility does prove to be dependable and cost effective, we'll need technology solutions to enable that orchestration of demand flex that maximizes those local grid benefits. We believe that our forthcoming AMI 2.0 deployment will give us more insight and definitely the additional capabilities that will enable the integration of demand flex into the distribution planning and execution process. This integration will then allow us to reduce those circuit peak loads, defer capital investments, and then ultimately improve overall grid reliability and resilience. Next slide, please. So integration of the equity scenario learnings into the DPEP was also a requirement of the study. And again, as a reminder, the equity scenario was designed to explore that atypical DER adoption pattern, focusing on prioritizing DER adoption in disadvantaged communities and other priority populations. However, the results of this scenario revealed that it did not lead to significantly greater number of new capacity projects when compared to the base scenario. So if policies were in place to enable this pattern of DER adoption in disadvantaged communities, there would not be a significant increase in cost or investments needed, as SD's distribution system provides relatively equitable access to grid capacity for all customers seeking to adopt DER. Next slide, please. So here I'll pass it off to my colleague, Ricky Santos, who's going to take us through a few of the next slides here.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone. I'm Ricky Santos, Senior Engineer at Grid Policy with SCE. So here we're looking at a comparison of historical completed projects to our EIS2 scenarios. So in the table above, we have the EIS scenarios listed compared against the project counts for different types of projects. The first row is the historical completed, and this is a range from 2020 through 24, which is a 5-year time horizon. And then the 4 rows below lists all the EIS2 scenarios that were studied, the base, the equity, and the demand flexibility initial and demand flexibility alternate. Each of those EIS2 scenarios range from the 2025 through 2040 horizon, which is a 16-year time frame. So when we look at all of these numbers, what we're seeing is that when you look at the historical completed project counts against generally all of the EIS2 scenarios, we're seeing about a 5 to 10 times increase in number of projects for the types of projects listed here. Then in the second table below, this is showing the associated costs of the historical completed projects for each of those mitigation types based on the total closed work order. Next slide, please. So as you saw with those increase in projected projects, for our supply chain strategy, we have both near-term actions and long-term strategies. We're currently engaging with critical manufacturers to align production plans with project needs. On top of that, we're expanding our pool of qualified suppliers so we don't have to depend on a few select manufacturers. This will ultimately improve our procurement flexibility. We're also taking a closer look at our internal planning processes, such as integrated planning. This involves developing the best solutions to address multiple grid needs at a geographical location in one shot. So this will help minimize rework and reduce costs for labor, design, and material. And then for long-term strategies, what we're doing is considering long-term financial commitments with select manufacturers to make sure that our supply chain is reliable. We will also continue to monitor the market for all available qualified resources to mitigate potential disruptions. So as you saw 2 slides ago, again, some areas will see project increases by 5 to 10 times compared to past rates. To manage this, we're also updating our workforce strategy. And our workforce strategy includes benchmarking, reassessing team skills, expanding recruitment, balancing workloads through both internal talent and contractors. We cannot rely simply on just hiring more people. We also plan to boost technical improvements through AI-assisted design, automating tasks where possible, and integrated planning as we discussed earlier. These are all ways that will help us expand our execution capacity. So within integrated planning, it'll achieve substantial scoping and execution efficiency while balancing affordability, enhancing customer experience, and delivering on timely customer energization. And affordability is really high on our list to reduce design and construction costs to really allow us to do more with what we have. For labor resource needs within the company, those will depend on budget authorizations and where there are other investment priorities around the company. So really our workforce planning must account for all of this type of work, those other investment priorities across the company, not just the low growth projects cited in the EIS2 study that were driven by the distribution planning process. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Anne, who will be covering the forecast methodology.
Thanks, Ricky. Next slide, please. So just to set the stage on how we designed our EIS2 analysis, we want to describe our load modeling approach and our DR forecast allocation approach for the 4 scenarios that were studied. So for all 3 scenarios, we're using key data inputs like the 2023 IEPR forecast, SCADA and AMI data, plus economic and demographic data. We build load shapes using historical profiles and sector-specific data, and then apply multilinear regression and weather normalization. And then to make sure that everything checks out, we validate the disaggregated loads and roll them up to make sure it matches the CEC or IEPR system level values. Now for the DR forecast allocation, things are different for these scenarios. For the base scenario, we stick with the IEPR forecast and zip code mapping. And then the equity scenario adds that priority population data to make sure we're accounting for the disadvantaged communities. And then for demand flexibility, we pull inputs from the CEC's demand flexibility tool to capture that flexibility potential. Next slide, please. So now we can get into a high-level overview of how load growth and DR growth forecasts are developed, how they are combined into a net forecast, and then compared against equipment ratings to develop grid needs and ultimately the solutions. And so these are the foundational steps, and they are represented by the 4 dotted boxes that you see on the screen. So starting with the load growth forecast, which is on the top left, we start with the structure level base profile creation, and then use historical loading data to identify and forecast long-term trends using regression, and then ultimately to develop an asset-specific shape. And then we collect all of our known load growth data, and then we calibrate it to the IEPR, and then add on our incremental load growth data to the base growth. And since this process began with a structural level forecast, we want to aggregate the related structures to the circuit level in order to understand the circuit level needs as well. And then on the bottom left is our DER forecast. The DER forecast is first disaggregated to the circuit level, and then we want to take it down one level to the structure level so that we can have the DER forecast be on the same levels as the load growth forecast above. And then we combine the load growth forecast and the DER forecast to have a net profile shown on the top right box, which we then utilize what we call profile analytics to extract each asset's peak in order to inform the needs assessment. Then in the final bottom right box, we utilize a partially automated capacity analysis and solutioning script to identify those grid needs and then ultimately develop mitigations based on our established criteria, or what we call triggers. Next slide, please. So the previous slide was that high-level overview. We're just gonna double-click down a little bit on how the net forecast is developed from the previous slide. And so this process is used for all 4 scenarios in EIS2, and it's also used in SE's annual distribution planning process. And I think this slide was also presented at the distribution forecasting working group. So the inputs to each of the steps are on the left side, and then the corresponding processes or steps are in the middle. And so it starts off with the load growth projects and representative sector load shapes being used to identify embedded load growth projects, where load shapes are then mapped to our structures. Next, SCADA, AMI, weather, and economic and demographic data are used to develop an econometric forecast. And then we use a multivariable regression model to calculate long-term growth trends. We then collect all of our known load growth data and then calibrate it to the IEPR. And then after that, we disaggregate the remaining IEPR base energy forecast using allocation factors. Lastly, the IEPR DER forecast and incremental load growth data and associated shapes are then added to the load forecast at the circuit level to ultimately get our final net load forecast. All right, next slide, please. So this slide here really just takes all the information from the previous slide and reorganizes into a table. This slide here really is just a summary of all of our inputs and methodologies for the various steps within our load disaggregation process. And so you'll see the different steps on the left-hand side, and then the methods that were used in those steps on the right-hand side. So let's see. I'll also note here that the load and DER disaggregation methodology is also thoroughly reviewed in the annual verification and validation process that we partner with the independent professional engineer on. And this is on top of all of our internal validation procedures as well. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass it to my colleague, Brent Buffington, who will go into more detail on the DER disaggregation for all the scenarios.
And let's see, I can get video. There we go. Hello, everyone. So I think I was introduced already, but Brent Buffington, I am in charge of demand forecast at SE. Typically, my team works on like system-wide sales forecasts, but we do have some roles in distribution planning. And so I'm talking about the DER disaggregation and then the shape modifications for the two or the three ES Part 2 scenarios. So we always start with the IEPR, so the IEPR DR inputs, and allocate down to eventually structure, but this is circuit. So we use adoption indicators related to historical adoption, customer kind of demographic data, economic growth estimates for across the service territory. For some DRs like PV, we use a vast diffusion model. And so it's really just an exercise that IEPR gives us the total energy, and we're allocating down to the circuit level in each year. We go through, and this actually is from our DFWG presentation. So we present this. It's been pretty static for a while. If you want more information, I think that's the venue to go to, because we cover this in a lot of detail. The DR shapes are generally from the IEPR, and for better, we're pulling like the system level shapes from the CEC's work. We do develop our own shapes for some DRs. TE charging in particular is one that we impose our own shapes on. We'll cover that, I think, in a later slide. But one note there is something we realized through this process is my team has been adding additional flexibility to the TE charging shape beyond the existing TOU. And so that's an interesting finding that we had, and impacts some of the results, because there's less delta between especially the initial demand flexibility case and our base case, because we've actually added more flexibility in the base case than probably should be there, because we've imposed updated TOUs that don't exist today. So maybe there's a philosophical debate to be had on how much flexibility, assumptions we should add to our base case analysis, how much we should leave to kind of alternative flexible cases. But let's move on to the next slide. So this is a representation of how light duty EV charging shapes change over time. Showing light duty because that's the largest segment, and so quite a bit of our TE load is this light duty shape. You can see it changed over time. There's a few things changing. So one is changing dynamics between at least in assumptions between home charging, that's residential circuit charging, that kind of charging at residence, to versus away from home charging. That's energy resellers, DC fast charging or level 2 chargers, destination chargers. So that would be away from home charging. That's also depot charging for light duty fleets. So just in general, of the total population in the near term, we're expecting 75%, 76% of all light duty EV charging is happening at residences, and that decreases over time. Kind of makes sense as adoption gets deeper. kind of more diverse customers are adopting EVs. We expect that large scale EV adoption based on the IEPR adoption rates by the 2040 period, and so more away from home charging. There's also, like I said, additional dynamics here. These are composite shapes of like all the different modes that people might charge. There's some people even in 2040 on like non-TOU, or they behave like they're not on TOU, maybe we should say. So that that they're charging when they need to or want to charge. Typically, we use census data on when people arrive home, people arrive at work, to figure out kind of when their optimal time to charge would be, like personally, like outside of prices. We have our existing TOU. So SE has a EV TOU rate that incentivizes charging after 9 p.m. So we have that rate in here. We also have a modified TOU that doesn't exist today in our base case shape. Well, again, question whether it should be in our base case, but it's a TOU that we've applied that's kind of smooths out that kind of 9 p.m. ramp up. Because there's, if you leave in just the existing TOU, you start to have problems at 9 p.m. So we've, put that in. And I think there's also like a, dynamic charging program in there as well to kind of smooth out the charging. Once again, all charging profiles, especially in 2040, are speculative, but that's the way we've speculated them. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is maybe not that interesting, but this is our non-res energy storage load shape. This is directly from the CEC IEPR. This is another one that we, in the flex scenarios, modify a bit to be more optimal. Let's move on to the next slide. Have we already covered this?
Brent, I could take it from here.
Oh yeah. Sorry, this is you. Okay.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Brent. So this process is used in the EAS Part 2 for all scenarios for our secondary analysis. Really, the objective here is to assess the impact of DER adoption on the distribution service, transformers, and service lines. It involves disaggregating the 2023 CEC IEPR DER forecast from the circuit level to individual meters. So looking at the first process step in the yellow box there, we disaggregate circuit level DER to the individual meter account. Two sets of input data are leveraged depending on DER type, as depicted by the two yellow arrows on the left. For energy storage, PV, and residential light duty EV, we leverage historical DER adoption data. Then for all DER adoption data within the secondary analysis, we also utilize customer meter and historical peak demand information using AMI data and Python. The next step is to determine the DER forecast at a service transformer by aggregating the disaggregated DERs from roughly 5 million individual meter accounts to their corresponding structure. The next process step is to generate the net forecasted load profile. Here, we apply the disaggregated DERs to its representative shape and then incorporate it into the gross structure level forecast. Next slide, please. So these next 3 slides are going to capture the details on data sources and methodology used to disaggregate the circuit level 2023 IEPR DER forecast to individual customers. So for this first slide, solar, PV, and energy storage, they have similar approaches. For customers without existing PV or energy storage, the method is to disaggregate based on peak demand and customer classification. Existing customers with PV or energy storage are excluded. So the main takeaway here is that the computation gets you proportional to the forecast at the circuit to the structure level for each customer classification type. So the general formula is that will apply to all DER types, and these are the sets of equations for both solar PV and energy storage. So I'll go through one of them. For residential solar PV customer, this is the ratio of the peak of a residential customer without PV over the summation of the residential customer without PV at that circuit. We then multiply that ratio by the IEPR amount of PV at that circuit. This will then get you the disaggregated PV for the residential customer. And then that bottom formula within that same yellow bubble is the same, but for a non-residential customer. And then energy storage follows that same equation. Next slide, please. For transportation electrification, this setup is pretty similar. I'll go through the methodology and data sources used for these DER types. For light duty EV residential, we take the residential customers without light duty EV, and then we disaggregate them based on peak demand. So we leverage historical billing records and peak demand data. For commercial EV customers, we proportionally disaggregate based on peak demand and leverage peak demand data. Then for medium duty, heavy duty EV, we actually excluded this from disaggregation to existing secondary assets. This is because most medium/heavy duty customers would not connect to the secondary system and would likely remain at the primary system. This is based on our historical customer requests for medium duty and heavy duty customers. And then you see the similar equations below that we saw previously, so I won't go into detail on those. Next slide, please. And so for energy efficiency and fuel substitution, it follows a similar methodology of proportioning the disaggregated based on peak demand for all customers. For energy efficiency, we proportionally disaggregate circuit level EE forecasts to the individual meter account based on both peak demand data, based on peak demand data for all customers, whereas for fuel sub, we do the same, but it's separated by customer classification. So then I'll be handing it over to my colleague, Brent Buffington.
So I should be back. Okay, so we're going to jump into the equity scenario. And so we have so once again, the scenarios are just really modifications of the base case. And our base case is our normal distribution plan, at least on the forecast side. And so to figure out what we need to do for the equity scenario, we created a metric that's not, as consistent as we could be with the way we do distribution planning to the EIS Part 2 scoping document. The metric ends up being, have we allocated kind of proportional megawatt hours to customers in DAX? So if there's 61% of customers are in DAX, so we allocate 61% of the DRs to those areas, through those disadvantaged communities. And we're actually, this also says DAC, it's actually priority populations is what's referenced in the document. So it's beyond DAX. And you can take a look at the link in the next slide. So if you have a copy of the slide that covers the priority populations, but that's what our metric is doing. And so, and this is how we figure out the incremental amounts of DRs, if there are any, that we need to be, allocated to disadvantaged community or priority population communities, or priority populations, maybe that's the right way to say it. beyond our base case. So now let's go to the next one, talk about the method using this metric as our guide. So like I said, on the step one is polled the priority populations. The state has happily or luckily provided an Excel file that lists kind of each census tract and their characteristics. And so that's our starting point to create a priority population score. Some of those characteristics are not directly that they're DAX, that they're like in the buffer zone, and some of them are like multiple characteristics of priority population. So we actually scored each census tract to create some differentiation between them. So like, how priority are they, I guess, is the point. And then we mapped those census tracts to our circuits. Now our circuits can cover multiple census tracts, and so there's so kind of additional scoring there. So I guess that's in step 3 of calculating this composite score of like the census tracts themselves have a score for like how priority population they are, and then our circuits are have a score based on what percentage of that circuit is within those kind of priority populations. And we create this composite score, which is a kind of weighted average of the two. And so that's how we can figure out how much of our existing DR disaggregation is going to priority populations, so circuits that are priority populations, and the kind of figuring out their relative percentage. We use that to run through the metric that I just showed to figure out what the kind of remainder, so what kind of how much additional DRs we need to make that inequality equal, right? And so that's kind of in step 5, and then step 6 is to actually allocate those additional DRs to circuits, that are serving priority populations proportionate to the amount of priority populations that they serve. So let's go to the next slide. And so these are the results. So once again, using the metric, scoring the census tracts, scoring the circuits based on which census tracts that they serve, running through. Oh, the camera seems to have died. I assume you can still hear me, but something went weird with the camera. So scoring the circuits, running through the inequality, and then we figured out that these are the amounts of incremental DRs we need to add to priority population areas to make the inequality equal. And so in losing some context here, because for how many megawatt hours, I think this was this 10% of the total light duty EVs. So we actually added, and by 2040, I think it was like 20 terawatt hours of light duty EVs. And so this is 2 terawatt hours. So it's maybe 11% of increase in light duty EVs in priority population areas to get the inequality to be equal. For residential energy storage and PV, much smaller changes. So I will note that this residential energy storage is the forecast impact. So this is representing efficiency losses. So the actual like nameplate megawatts is not this number, or this isn't like the installed megawatts. This is the efficiency losses of those, like the load impacts of the residential energy storage. And then the PV, this is actually nameplate, pretty small amounts. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we're already on deflex. Okay, so let's jump into the flexible calculation. So this is the same method for both of the demand flexibility scenarios. And so we'll kind of go through the steps, but they're the same aside from a couple parameters that we'll talk about in a little bit. So the first step was to identify the circuit peaks from the base case analysis. So that's housed in Snowflake. So my team used Python to pull that out. That's fairly straightforward. So circuit by circuit, so across 4,000 circuits. So looked at that load and then looked at the determined the flexible potential. So the flexible potential is we based it on the CEC's deflex assumptions for how much of each end use can be flexible. And so there's some parameters that we'll go through, but we identified the circuit peaks, looked at the DR shapes underneath those circuit peaks on a circuit by circuit basis, and based on the amount of flexible potential that at least the CEC's deflex assumptions have, we modified each shape. So it's like custom DR shapes for each circuit relative to the amount of flexible potential. I think I added to chat. So we flexed specifically 3 hours. Why 3 hours and not 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours? 3 hours seemed like a reasonable amount of like this because we're flexing every day. There's some good reasons for that because this is like behavior, like a persistent change in behavior, and at least my team didn't feel, or maybe I didn't feel that having 8 hours of change each day made sense. 3 hours seemed like a reasonable amount for like a behavior change from where people want to use load to where they will kind of use load on an ongoing basis. So that impacts the results, and we'll talk about that in the conclusions here, or at least my takeaways from the flexibility exercise. So once again, created new DR load shapes for each DR, DR that we covered at least, for each circuit, and then we kind of run that through so this is multi DR to newly created load. Oh yeah, so we just kind of run that through our normal process to figure out the impacts of these new DR shapes. Let's go to the next slide I think we should have some example here. Oh, okay, well, yeah, so this is the deflex framework. So these are the parameters that we applied, and the kind of megawatt impact is the one at the bottom, is that formula. So for those kind of the uninitiated, and I certainly was, not that long ago. So there's 3 parameters in the deflex framework. So control strategy eligibility. So this is the percent of the load that is eligible to shift. So for HVAC is a good example. There's, if someone has a analog thermostat, they would not be eligible for like an automatic temperature control scheme. Or if they don't have, or I guess the alternative would be to have some kind of cutoff, kind of breaker cutoff control box at the HVAC unit. So that having that would make them eligible. Having a fully analog, nothing connected would make them ineligible. The control strategy eligibility for like EVs is very high. I think it approaches 100. And then participation rate is probably the biggest deal of how many folks within that, within the eligible population are going to participate. So kind of what percentage. will participate, or can you get to participate? So that's the one that we flexed between the two flex cases. And so we'll look at the impacts there. Once again, relative to our base case, which my conclusion is that we added too much flexibility to our base case distribution plan. And so we consumed some of that flexibility. So there's less load in those peak hours to move, and therefore less impacts. But this participation rate is kind of relative to the load in that, in those, or this whole framework is relative to the load that actually shows up in those hours. And then unit impact is of those that are eligible and participating, how much of their load will actually drop. Like it's, I normally think about this as compliance. So of the folks that are participating, what percentage of them are compliant, like to the thing that we were actually asking or hoping that they do. And then you can see the formula at the bottom is kind of multiply those across the board. So this end use, consumption and shape gets us the end use load. Like the first two terms get us the end use load in any hour. And then the three final terms, control strategy, eligibility, unit impact, and participation, get us the kind of additional flexibility, from demand flexibility, within this kind of forecast framework. Let's move on to the next slide. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So I should note that the deflex assumptions are rooted in that same LBNL study that everyone is anchored on, but it's got kind of custom assumptions by the CEC on top of it. So our base case uses those assumptions directly for a select set of end uses. And so these are the end uses that we flexed. And the control strategy, eligibility, participation rate, and impact from the deflex assumptions. And so we flexed light duty EVs, medium duty EVs, non-res energy storage, residential energy storage, and HVAC. I think I added to chat, like HVAC is the 1,000-pound gorilla, and probably the biggest deal the biggest deal today, and even going forward, because there's already flexible programs around those other end uses, like light duty EVs in particular. All the utilities already have time of use rates. So, and those apply to whether it's like through an energy reseller, like a DC fast charger. So those energy resellers are on TOU rates, and presumably they're passing on those TOUs to their customers. And then for residential and businesses, they're incentivized to have TOU rates. I don't think it's mandatory at this point, but so there's recognition even in our base case that those loads are flexible. They're already flexing a bit, right? That they're already modifying their behavior in the world that we're in today, and this is kind of flexing beyond that. Rather quickly make it okay. Yeah. So then the residential energy storage and non-res, those storage systems exist to take advantage of TOU rates. So they are theoretically already optimized to the TOU. So in so much as the TOU is matches up with the circuit level needs, there wouldn't be much additional flexibility from those. HVAC is an area where generally the reason the peak exists is because of HVAC. So finding ways to flex HVAC, creates a lot of value from both kind of large scale system planning, but also distribution planning. So the all that said, control strategy eligibility for like EVs is 100%. These participation rates are, once again, from DFlex, where, light duty EVs, somewhere around 7%, medium duty, heavy duty, around 50%, energy storage, non-res and res, around 20%, and then impacts are fairly high for those in the DFlex assumptions. HVAC, participation rates, so somewhere around like the mid to high 20s for control strategy eligibility. Participation rates, fairly low, but I think those are higher than what we're seeing today in HVAC programs. And then, impacts for HVAC at 60%. I think that's an average. I saw a presentation recently where like the first hour is like 80%. And then that drops off fairly quickly in that kind of existing flex programs. Let's move on to the next slide. So here is an example of demand flexibility. So this is the shape of EV demand on the Grizzly circuit on the final day of the study. So that's December 31st, 2040. And so the three top hours were hour ending 22, 23, and 24. And using the DFlex assumptions, so using the participation or the control strategy eligibility, and now I forget it was 90 or 100% in the prior slide. The participation rate and the impact, we're able to move load out of those top 3 hours and redistribute it to the other hours. This is, once again, this is on that same day for a different circuit. It might move load out of different hours. You see, this is a kind of winter day, so we have a kind of double hump where we have kind of heating and other loads in the morning, and then the kind of the overnight load. This also kind of highlights a time where like EV charging, maybe even like the SETOU, is kind of pushing load into where the peak hours would be in 2040. And so once again, for each circuit, for each of those end uses covered in the earlier slide, we're moving load out of those top 3 hours consistent with like how much load is hitting in the base case and the DFlex assumptions. So let's move on to the next one. All right, so then get some feedback from Energy Division that they want to see bigger numbers. So we wanted to explore what with the kind of existing framework, what we could get. And so using all the same parameters, we actually upped the participation rate to 100%, and reran the whole exercise with 100% participation for those select end uses. Left HVAC cooling the same. Didn't make sense, at least to me and team, to assume 100% of AC would move out of the hours that people wanted the most. So let's move on to the next slide.
Brent, there's a hand up.
Okay.
Gabe, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. I just wanted to clarify, I don't really agree that Energy Division, quote, wanted to see big numbers. We specifically found that your demand flex scenario looked very business as usual compared to the base case. And we wanted to see if you were fully exploring the potential of demand flexibility to realize greater savings. So, you know, I'm not sure how you got to 100% participation as an assumption, but would like to understand what that really means. But I mainly just wanted to clarify that, you know, we think that demand flexibility is an important tool that has potential. But when we saw that the results didn't really look any different than the base case, we were wondering, you know, are you really looking at its potential? And you know, that doesn't mean we want you to make up numbers. So I just wanted to clarify that. Let you get back to your presentation.
Yeah, I apologize, and I did misspeak. So, you know, we did get feedback that the case looked fairly close to the base case, and in response, we decided to explore what a larger scenario would be. And so, so yeah, this is not at the specific guidance, but properly taking feedback and so we explored this scenario where we upped the participation rate for EVs and energy storage to 100% and ran it through again. Let's go to the next one. Do we cover the results here? I think we do. And so actually, maybe we'll go back a slide, because I want to talk about the shape impacts, and this deck doesn't have the shape representation. But what it's going to do for like light duty EVs, the hour ending like 22, 23, and 24, once again, it's a very simple method. So this shape, this is the kind of shaped energy. This is how much EV load shows up on the circuit in that, in each hour of each day. And by upping the participation rates to 100%, we drop out nearly all EV load in 22, 23, and 24. Not all of it, because I think it was 50% or 90% impact. But we're dropping out a bunch of load. So in so much as like, it looks like hour ending 1 is like the 4th highest hour, or maybe, hour ending 21 is the 4th highest, hard to tell. But now that becomes the most constraining time. So this was not run iteratively to create like a new optimal shape. It was fairly simplistic, where the top hours were identified, and then the exercise is to figure out how much of those eligible end uses are in those hours, and then move them to other hours. And so I think that has an impact on the 100% participation case, because we're moving a lot of load, much more than the CEC deflux assumptions had. But because it's not being done iteratively to like, kind of ratchet down the shape to like re-optimize the shape, we're not getting as large impacts for that scenario. So, okay, so I see maybe a couple of questions. Maybe we can handle now. Shifts. Yeah, so on the pre-cooling, yeah, so that's kind of the idea of like the 2 to 3 hours. Like HVAC is the biggest component of the load, and I mean, frankly, pre-cooling in at least Southern California is not very effective as far as we can tell, just because the low quality of insulation, kind of the building shell, is pretty low quality. So that, there's already the impacts of like how many of those HVAC systems are eligible, but then like the impact of pre-cooling is, I mean, it's not nothing, but houses warm up very quickly. And if we're trying to move load around on the peak day of the year, so for at least in Southern California, that means it's likely the hottest day of the year, at least the hottest afternoon of the year. You really have to question how much we can, for HVAC, how many hours we can make people uncomfortable when they want their AC the most. And I think it's something that, as we move forward as a kind of larger stakeholder group, have to be really thoughtful about. We've already provided folks financial incentives via TOU rates to not use electricity during those peak hours. And if we're assuming that they have seen those rates and still want to run their AC in those hours, what additional actions we can take via utility programs to get there. And my personal take is that building shell investments is the thing, at least for HVAC. But for this exercise, yes, we're kind of moving load from those hours into other hours for HVAC. So let's, I see Emily's question. We scroll up one to look at what impact means. So impact, as the definition, as maybe one more up for the definitions. So once again, I think it behooves us to go back to control strategy eligibility. So this is of the end use, how many are eligible to be in this program or have this control. Participation rate is just straight up of those, how many are going to participate, and the unit impact of the load of those participants, how much of it could be shifted or dropped, or how much should we assume would be shifted or dropped. And so that the actual parameters are on the next slide. So let's go to the next slide. For battery energy storage, it's a good example of it's 100%. So there are automatic systems that humans don't rely on for comfort or anything else. So since those systems exist for kind of value optimization, the impact's 100%. For light duty EVs, it's fairly high. For medium duty, heavy duty is assumed to be moderate. That you can ask them to do something, but they may or may not do it depending on their business needs. And HVAC, I think that is rooted in actual analysis of HVAC flex programs from LBNO, but the full looking at the CCD flex study, I think we can find the actual source for that. So I think that covers the two questions in chat. Let's scroll down a couple slides to here. Okay, so I compiled the deflex. Actually, there's both. So both deflex scenarios here, and I do want to maybe talk about the challenges, even summarizing the impacts, because and I think what we had shown Energy Division staff initially was like the coincident peak impact, and that's where we got kind of the initial feedback on the numbers, and that's actually not a great way to look at it, given that nothing happens on the distribution system because of the system-wide coincident peak. This is done on a kind of circuit by circuit, structure by structure basis. So the numbers we're representing here are the non-coincident circuit peak impacts. So looking at how the deflex assumptions are impacting the circuit the individual circuit peaks. And so this is a kind of better representation of the impacts that would actually drive costs, right, and drive kind of circuit needs. And so you can see that by 2040, we have a gigawatt of impact from those end uses. And once again, this is like a low estimate because our base case for ES Part 2, which is based on our 2025 DPP, added too much flexibility. And so my team will remedy that in kind of future DPPs. But for this one, it was already embedded, those like TOUs that don't exist today and additional flex programs. So it's a 1 gigawatt relative to that base case. And then the alternative deflex pulls out another 400 megawatts. And once again, we upped to 100%, but since we're only pulling from 3 hours and not iteratively re-optimizing how we're asking customers to move their load, the impacts are not as large as they could be if it was like fully re-optimized, right? Because theoretically, if you have 100% participation and you can get many hours of optimization across there, or you can ask different customers to do different things at different times, you can maybe at least in modeling space find a different outcome or more impacts. I should also note that we modeled everything as shift and not shed, although especially in the 100% case, it's hard to tell the difference between shift and shed. So it kind of like shift is like a proxy for shed. There's also kind of a philosophical modeling space question here of whether shed should ever be modeled on the demand side. The challenge there is if you're shedding load, then are you actually studying the IEPR in the first place, right? It's like a world where we shed all the load and it's just like, so you kind of take this to the extreme and, there's no load in that day if you shed everything. And so we shifted the load. It doesn't really impact the results, but it kind of, the shift proxy for shed, but we shifted every day. So, we didn't presuppose that this will only happen on the single peak day. And so our total shift is fairly robust because we're like considering this to be a kind of persistent behavioral change that happens all the time, can be relied upon. And so we get 400 gigawatt hours of shift in 2040 and 3 terawatt hours of shift. Once again, the shift is really big in that alternative deflex case, even though the peak impact is not as big, right? The delta is not as big because a fair amount of that peak is HVAC that we're not flexing as much, and that peak is likely happening in that 4th hour that we didn't re-optimize to move load from. So there's some significant limitations of our deflex case, the implementation side, and that has kind of downstream impacts on our results. And then, so I think I covered the points at the right. Let me make sure I covered them fully. Yeah, so I think if we're going to do this, like if this is going to be real, real enough to be considered in typical planning, we'd have to be really careful to set the base case, the current mitigations well, and then be like prepared to optimize the customers on the same circuit in different ways to get the impacts that we need. And in modeling space to also kind of replicate that and have like this like an iterative optimization approach, where you can actually modify, know why each hour is being modified, like going back to an individual customer loads, so that in modeling space you can rely on it, and then that needs to be reflected in reality where those loads are moving from those hours. I think that might cover the demand flexibility case. I think I saw a suggestion maybe we stop for additional questions here.
There's a question in the chat by Cindy Lee from Cal Advocates. For the base case, you mentioned that you were assuming a time of use rate that does not yet exist. Is the design an explanation of how the rate was developed in the report?
I've not seen that question, but yeah, it is not currently in the report. So in fact, I don't even know if it's well covered in the DFWG work. But yeah, we can add that to the report for the base case analysis.
Okay, thank you. Then I think you covered Emily's question regarding impact. And we can move on before we receive more questions. And I would like to ask attendees to raise your hands if you want to go ahead and speak after we are, I think, almost done with the presentation, to start the Q&A. So yeah, we can go ahead, Brent.
Okay, I don't know what the next slide is. And was it still me? Oh yeah, I guess. Okay, so I think this was a requirement to put in, cover this in other slides. But this covers the inputs, methods, how the inputs change, or kind of the different inputs, what the model structure was, validation procedures, and the disaggregation approach. I'll go through this since we do have time. So once again, the base case is the 2023 IEPR. The energy forecast, zip code level data on customers, current DR adoption, customer segmentation, and 8760 load shapes generally from the IEPR as well. Once again, as I mentioned, we develop our own TE shapes. I guess that's covered in the next one. The adoption is kind of business as usual, or kind of as we expect. So there's some economic indicators that drive economic indicators on like the demographic information, but also the kind of fast diffusion, kind of internal economic analysis for like PV adoption. So we can have propensity models, and borrow from kind of wherever we can to kind of fill out those propensity models, and once again to allocate the base case. We kind of validate this. Once again, this is our normal DPP, so kind of validate this process and publish it for our annual process. Spatial disaggregation, it's kind of zip code mapping, customer attributes. So I think that's maybe kind of duplicative. For the equity scenario, in addition, we got that data from about priority populations linked before. the same, everything is the same, like the load shapes as the base case. Then we, adjust the DR allocation. In this case, we increase the DR amounts to meet that inequality. I think, as I noted, it was like 10% increase in light duty EVs, but like fairly small changes otherwise. That scoring system where we score priority population census tracts and then also circuits relative to those priority populations. We use the structure of the inequality that Energy Division came up with, but use it on an energy basis to fit with how we allocate DRs. And then the kind of spatial disaggregation, it's that kind of scoring process and mapping from census tract to circuits is the special thing there. The key inputs for demand flexibility is the CEC deflex assumptions workbook. Something I didn't mention, and I'm glad it's here. So we don't separately forecast HVAC. It's kind of built into our consumption model, but we use the NREL restock data to derive out the HVAC load. So this is like we added a capability through the demand flexibility in particular to derive out the HVAC end use so that we can flex it. So we use the restock data. And then the kind of various IEPR DR forecasts was the key input there. We adjusted the load shapes for each day, for each circuit, for each end use that we covered. And then, we modified those to reflect the flexible demand potential in those top hours and kind of reallocate the load to other hours, effectively modeling a shift in demand. It's a simplified application of the CEC deflex methodology is the kind of main kind of model. We base everything on the CEC assumptions, at least the initial case, and then modify those assumptions for the alternative case. And then the spatial disaggregation approach, circuit level flex profiles, and HVAC estimates. So I wonder if this is my last slide. Let's maybe go to the next one. And then I think is it back to you, Ricky?
Yes, back to me. Thank you, Brent. So now we're getting into the needs assessment methodology. Really, this is how we determine what the need is by comparing the load profile versus the load limit. So what you see here in the green curve is the 24-hour profile. Then in the purple, on the purple line, you'll see the 10-year capacity limit being around 12 megawatts. So really what this needs assessment methodology is doing is taking these profiles, doing a peak analysis. So we're looking at a single point in time, in this example at the 17th hour, where that peak is at roughly 16 megawatts. Then we compare that to the capacity limit at 12 megawatts. So the delta is where we arrive at the asset capacity need at 4 megawatts. I want to note that load flow simulations were not used to develop the needs in our study, but instead a more streamlined approach using a Python script that extracts these peaks and develops the needs across the system. And then we have a decision logic to determine the appropriate solution, which will not be as granular as our typical annual distribution planning process. The process is similar for developing the needs on the secondary network as well, where we will capture the projected peak at the service transformer and then compare it to the capacity limit to then determine the need. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into the partially automated solutioning script. Really, the main function here is to evaluate several criteria to determine when and how the various mitigation types are triggered, which will go into the next slide. So I'll take you through what this solutioning script actually does. For primary system solutioning, it first mimics the current annual planning process. So there's a pre-processing script that cuts over a 4 kV system load where load is exceeding equipment limitations. In cases where a 4 kV cutover need is identified, it will then transfer the projected load of the affected 4 kV circuits or substations to the nearest higher voltage system. After the 4 kV cutovers and eliminations are identified, the solutioning script then evaluates several criteria for other mitigation types. Within the primary solutioning, the post-processing script then reviews the first 10 years of needs for each sub and advances large distribution circuit upgrades or new circuits to replace small DCUs in an earlier year. For example, if small DCUs are identified in, say, years 3 through 5, but a large DCU is required in years 6 through 7, then the script will show that a large DCU is needed from years 3 through 7. This is aimed at identifying most cost-effective solution for multiple years of needs. Then for the secondary system, it's similar. When the net forecast is generated at the service transformer level, the existing service transformers are flagged for upgrade if the projected load exceeds the capacity limit. Our secondary analysis does not include new transformers for new service connections. And then after the script develops these solutions, we then validate these results through a manual review, looking at a set of sample areas, and then making necessary revisions to the script as needed. Next slide, please. So here's our mitigation methodology for both primary system upgrades and secondary system upgrades. Everything besides the bottom row is part of the primary system upgrade mitigation types. On the left column, you'll see the mitigation type. For the first 5 rows, they're in ascending order based on typical scope of work. Then in the bottom 3 rows, we have specific mitigations for 4 kV cutovers, eliminations, and then secondary upgrades. Our partially automated solutioning script does not have the ability to identify mitigation measures for underground cable temperature criteria violations. Therefore, DCU project counts exclude underground cable system upgrade projects driven by thermal overloads. In the second column, we have the typical scope of work. These descriptions may be different depending on the voltage level and scope, but it just gives a general idea of what would be included in cost estimates. Since this is a partially automated script, like I mentioned, the third column really is the logic or required triggers and conditions. These triggers are applied to the needs to determine the mitigation, and the required triggers also closely model our distribution planning guidelines. So you'll see that some of these triggers on the right side column have an AND function and others have an OR function. So we'll go through a couple examples describing that. So for example, for a new distribution circuit to actually be proposed by the script, either of the following required triggers would need to occur for the script to recommend a new circuit. So looking at the right column, if cumulative circuits loading at a given distribution sub exceeds cumulative circuit capacity by more than 50 amps, or if more than 50% of the circuits at a given distribution sub exceed standard capacity limit, or if a large distribution circuit upgrade count at a given substation is greater than 3. So again, because this is an or statement, any of these triggers can happen for a new circuit to be proposed. Now we'll look at an example that requires an AND function. So for large distribution circuit upgrades that would be proposed by the automated script, typical work for large DCUs includes building ties between circuits, line extensions, large reconductors greater than a mile, and adding automation equipment. So the necessary triggers for a large DCU requires 2 conditions to be both met. The first one being is if the cumulative circuit loading at a given distribution sub does not exceed the total capacity circuit limit, and fewer than 50% of the circuits exceed their capacity limit. So for example, if a substation has 4 of 9 circuits that are above the circuit capacity, we would elect to build a large distribution circuit upgrade rather than step to the next solution, which would be a new circuit. The reason why we chose 50% is based on estimates of average large distribution circuit upgrades cost compared to a new circuit cost, as well as our average circuit count in a substation. For instance, let's say an average cost of the large distribution circuit upgrade is around 800,000 and a new circuit cost is around 3.2 million. And in that example above, where there are 4 circuits out of 9 that are above the circuit capacity, this would be right at the brink of a cost of the new circuit. 4 times 800K is around 3.2 million. However, if it were 5 distribution circuits that were above the loading limit, then that cost might be higher than building a new circuit, which then the script would propose to build a new circuit. Next slide, please. So now getting into our cost estimation methodology. In general, for both primary and secondary system costs are escalated to 2030 for the 2025 through 2030 study timeframe, and then they're escalated to 2035 for the 2031 through 2040 timeframe due to the absence of cost escalation data beyond 2035. We then can apply a contingency factor of 35% to most mitigation types and 50% for new subs, reflecting standard cost estimation practices to account for uncertainties and variability in project scope and costs. Again, this reflects industry standard cost estimation practices. I'd also like to note that in practice, these contingency factors are adjusted down throughout the project lifecycle. So, as we get closer to the project execution where the cost estimates get more accurate, those contingency factors theoretically would be reduced. Lastly, in general, operational costs such as construction expenses are embedded within the capital cost estimates. So moving into primary system costs, we use GRC unit costs where available. And if not available, we use costs from comparable completed or ongoing projects depending on the mitigation type. For secondary system costs, the service transformers use a historical closed work order data from years 2019 through 2025. And then in order for us to get the unit cost for each service transformer type, we get it by taking the total cost of the work order that includes labor costs, indirect costs, transformer costs, and secondary and service conductors. Then we take that total cost and divide it by the work order. We take that total cost of the work order and divide it by the number of transformers in that work order.
I
Thank
think
you.
that's the last slide for SCE. There were some questions here that I don't see that have been answered. So from Larissa Dobriansky, she asks, will you be continually evaluating what changes could be made to optimize customer participation doing different things at different times, including the difference that, oh, sorry, there we are. Including the difference that greater reliance on market forces could contribute, as for example, use of market platforms, dynamic pricing, etc., demonstrated in SE/D mix, etc. pilots.
Angelica, we're just determining who on the team can respond to that question. So
Yeah.
thanks for flagging that, team. Let's put our heads together on that. As we're looking at that question, can you tell us, Angelica, the other questions that
Yeah.
we still?
I see one from Said from UCAN. Is the required triggers column? And I think this was, I believe it's this slide, Said, just raise your hand if you wanna, I don't see Said. Okay, I think it's this one. So it says, is the required triggers column every criteria is based solely on a physical loading limit, loading exceeding existing capacity, for example, where in this methodology is the NWA screen?
Hi, this is
Thank you,
Ann
Said.
from.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead, Ricky.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, so SE did not consider the non-wireless alternatives in the solutioning script for EIS2.
Thank you. I see a hand up, Leo from Cal Advocates. I'm going to go ahead and request to unmute. Please speak whenever you're ready.
Hello, this is Leo Steinmetz from Cal Advocates. Thank you all for the presentation. I have a question about the secondary methodology, and it's sort of a wide scope question. So let me know if you're not able to answer. But I'm curious if it looks like you disaggregated all of the coming load onto existing service connections. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about whether the kinds of new loads that are coming online, especially things like charging stations, will require new service connections in new places where the secondary infrastructure doesn't cover very well and might require different kinds of costs. The reason I'm asking this question is not because I think that your methodology is missing something, but just because there are really big differences in costs between SCE and SDG&E's EIS Part 2 studies and PG&E's one. And so I know that you, of course, have all been focused on your own study and may or may not be able to comment on differences between the studies, but I'm just trying to understand kind of these differences that have come out and make sure I'm understanding if there's anything in your secondary methodology that might drive a difference, or if you think there are, costs that might be coming down the line that aren't captured here. So if you have any thoughts on that comparison with PG&E or on anything that might be absent from the existing secondary methodology, I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps I can take that on. So this is Steve Kim with SCE. First of all, we did not disaggregate the medium duty, heavy duty, for example, hyper forecast down to the existing structures, because to your point, a lot of them will be at least our historical data shows that they have been requesting for new services. So those were not disaggregated down to the existing structures. Now, only the ones that we have disaggregated down to the existing structures in the T sectors were light duty vehicles that were split between mostly residential transformers and some commercial customers. And arguably, to your point, some of those commercial disaggregation to the existing structure may be a good point that perhaps it does deserve, some revisit to that methodology if that's indeed right approach. But that's kind of how we are currently handling the, for example, home charging versus or from home charging, where it is being disaggregated down to the residential transformers and commercial transformers.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. Maybe a sort of more general follow-up is like this methodology is very comprehensive and you presented a lot of different ways that you're allocating different kinds of mitigations. Maybe just from your perspective, with any model, there are limitations and there are ways that the future is going to deviate from the model. Are there any kind of other secondary modeling limitations that you might be able to highlight? Not necessarily in the sense of something that you should put into the model, but just the fact that all modeling has limitations. Any kind of future uncertainty based on load growth that you're seeing now or customer behavior that you're seeing now, or other concerns that you might have about the way that the future might deviate from this kind of projection?
Hi, Leo. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for the question. Go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead, Ricky.
Yeah, so as you've stated, in our secondary analysis, we didn't include new service connections. Our reasoning is that there currently isn't a strong methodology to determine how many new transformers and their respective sizes will be needed to serve new load growth. I mean, definitely we
I'll
can,
just
capture this as like an area for improvement, and we can explore um, how to incorporate that, but currently we didn't have a methodology to do that.
and I'll just chime in here, this is Ari, that secondaries is something that has been added here in EIS Part 2, and it wasn't in EIS Part 1. And so like Ricky's stating, this is a relatively new methodology for us, new approach, I think new for everybody. So it's definitely something that's still under development, and definitely appreciate your interest in it. And we're aware that the PG&E numbers were quite a bit different. So hopefully our responses so far have explained some of that delta, but also this is a work in progress in terms of how to analyze secondaries.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you for the responses, and I would just encourage you in the final report, as much kind of extra context and clarity that you can provide to the secondary modeling would be helpful, just because I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on comparing among the reports because of this big difference with PG&E. So of course, a lot of that will be on PG&E to explain their sort of more complex and specific methodology. But since a lot of us are going to be trying to understand what's going on with that difference and just the sort of more examples and clarity and kind of caveats like the ones that you just shared with me, you can put in the final report, I think the better. But anyway, thank you so much for those clarifications. I really appreciate it.
I also want to address a couple of questions, and I may be joined by colleagues on this. We do have a few questions in here, I see from Ben at Cal Advocates about unit costs. And I think the answer to that is we took our unit costs from our 2025 GRC. So I know that data is available to Cal Advocates. I'm not confident if it's all public, but it's not. We didn't create new data for this report. We used our 2025 GRC. So I think that answers that question. You asked if we're going to include a table of that in the final report. We can look into whether or not that was public information. It is available to CPUC, but I'm not sure if it's public. But if it is, we can add a table. And then there was also a question going back to Larissa's question. I just in terms of future optimizations, sort of like secondaries, demand flex is relatively new. We want to build confidence in it make sure that it's a viable solution in our planning process, make sure that we're modeling it correctly and that we believe in the results we're getting. Obviously, we did 2 different scenarios here, and we're trying to triangulate on which is actually most realistic. But once we get confidence in that, we would continue to look for ways to optimize that and leverage the flexible load. So certainly something that we want to do, and we believe in it. And you know, like Gabe said earlier, ED also believes in it. So we want to find that realistic number, and also make sure that we continue to develop it as demand flex develops and our ability to model it develops. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Ari. We have a hand up from Sam Houston from UCS. I'm going to go ahead and request that you unmute yourself. Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much. This is Sam Houston from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question on that line of questioning that Leo had. I heard you say that new service connections are not included in the analysis. And I also heard that medium and heavy duty EV loads are expected to request new service connections. So I want to make sure I understand what that means for the purposes of the analysis. Does it possibly mean those loads were treated as additions to existing service connections? And if you expect a new service connection to be more expensive than existing, that it might underestimate a little bit? Or are those, the infrastructure requirements for a load like medium and heavy duty treated in some other way? So I just want to make sure I track that train of thought. And if there are any other loads that were treated that way, in reality, likely to need a new service connection, and the study had to be treated differently. If you have any other examples, I'd be keen to hear them, please.
Yeah, so to add to that, so medium duty, heavy duty forecasts specifically were incorporated at the circuit evaluation, but those just weren't disaggregated down to the secondaries, unlike the others that we have disaggregated down to the structures. So it's really the medium duty, heavy duty where the historical trend or historical experience dealing with those type of customers so far has been requesting all as a new service. Now, part of that is because we are offering some incentive programs like Charge Radio or 029 programs to share some of those cost burden for the customers to connect their medium duty, heavy duty chargers. So that may be one of the reasons why so far we have seen most of them, in fact, all of them coming in as a new service rather than coming on as a maybe expansion of their facility there where we could have potentially considered tapping off of from the existing transformers. I think just in general, new service transformer count estimation, to Ari's point, it's fairly new concept for us. It's unclear what the right methodology is to project how many new transformers and specifically for their sizes that our forecast could potentially require for us to kind of report out as a results here. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we have not necessarily included new service transformer count or cost in our analysis.
That's super helpful. And just to put a fine point on it, because you have counted them at the circuit level, any cost that would be incurred for a new service is excluded from this analysis. It's just not in the scope.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one question that was responded in the chat, but I think it has like a lot of content, and I would like to reformulate it, and if possible, like if you want to read whatever you responded again, I think Michael from SE you responded, but it's a question from Ben Hoffman, Cal Advocates. It was earlier this morning. So he asks that this might be out of scope, but PG&E found that the upgrade rate required by their study was similar to their historical values. in contrast to SEE's finding here. Could you please comment on that? And I think he's referring, let me see if I can find the slide here. To these numbers over here. And since this is going to be, this is being recorded, and we normally upload these recordings to the website, I would like to give SE the opportunity to address this question in video. So if anyone watches the video later, they can have an answer to that.
Yeah, thanks, Angelica. This is Michael Bergian. I'm the senior manager of our grid policy team in system planning and engineering, so I can speak to that since I provided the response in the chat. So in general, I think it's also related, Ben, to your other question, or I'm sorry, Gabe, your other question regarding the historical completed projects and the challenge with that metric in that it doesn't necessarily capture projects that may have been started or may made a lot of good progress through the design and construction, but not completed between the period of 2020 and 2024. So those, the first row of this table, historical completed 2020 through 24, may be somewhat of an underrepresentation of how much work actually flows through the process here. But in general, the difference, I mean, I can't speak to how the numbers here compare to PG&E's study results, but I think the observation that we have is, especially in the last couple of planning cycles, we've seen an increasing level of electric demand and electrification that is creating a significant increase in the number of grid needs and corresponding mitigation projects. So definitely, you know, on this cusp of high degree of electric demand that's uncharacteristic to what we've seen, even as recent as 2020 through 2024. So theoretically, even if these metrics were more inclusive and represented all of the work that went through the process, there is still a stark change in the amount of load growth. And then to further, you know, exacerbate that, we are adding things and more proactivity to the annual planning process for folks that are familiar with pending loads and scenario planning, where we anticipate we're going to capture even more grid needs on a longer lead time basis, which may help with levelizing the workload to some degree, and, you know, avoiding the solution where it's just doubling or tripling headcount to be able to push through the higher volume of work. But we do anticipate there is going to continue to be an uptick in the number of grid needs and corresponding projects that are needed.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. And it's just that the table kind of portrays, probably the numbers are not doing justice. The historical completed, for example, this one over here tells us around 20 small projects here, which are like 4 per, this is a 4-year gap, right? Or a 5-year gap. So it would be 4 projects per year. Whereas in the EIS base, we have a 15, 16 year here, which will tell us it's like a 10 small DCUs here. I think that's per year. So that's the difference that was highlighted, I believe. And maybe it's just, or add some, I would suggest just add some type of clarification when including these numbers in the final report, if it's your choice to include it. I had another question more related to the choice in methodologies for, well, when transforming or translating from circuits to zip codes. It is mentioned that you used Python code. However, from the other two IUs, we learned that they were using hexagons method, and that is the regular choice for when dealing with this type of data or geographic data. Is there a reason behind the methodology you chose when transforming zip code data into circuits?
Yeah, so this is Brent at SE. I think maybe this one's for me. Let's see if I got my camera working again. I think both the other utilities are using like a specific software that has GIS capabilities. So our disaggregation process does not rely on any specific software. It's all kind of, at least on my team side, the primary way to get from zip code level, like EV adoption data, to circuit level is all kind of done in-house. And so we don't have, specific GIS capabilities. So we're mapping circuits to zip codes kind of by hand. And so that's why we're using Python. Or that's why in this study we use Python for that purpose. And so if at some point we adopt some commercially available software, maybe that's a capability that we could add. But for now, we're doing this by hand.
Thank you. I kind of lost. I don't see anyone. Let's see. Are there any other questions anyone would like to address in the chat, or raise your hand before we move on? All right. Seeing none. Okay, I'll move on to our next step. So thank you, Southern California Edison, for your presentation and for the thoughtful discussion during the Q&A and during the whole presentation. I'll now briefly walk through the next steps for Electrification Impact Study Part 2. As a reminder, the next procedural milestone is stakeholder comments, which are due on December 15, 2025. The utilities' final EIS Part 2 reports will be filed on January 28th of 2026. Following those filings, the Commission will issue a ruling in the first quarter of 2026 to request stakeholder input on the final study reports. Finally, the Commission is expected to issue a decision in 2026 directing how the findings of EIS Part 2 studies will be incorporated into the utilities distribution planning and execution processes. Energy Division will continue to keep parties informed as these steps move forward. With that, we will conclude Day 2 of Electrification Impact Study Part 2 workshops. On behalf of CPUC's Energy Division, thank you all for your participation, your engagement, and your valuable feedback. If you have any...
Angelica?
Yes.
Can I ask one question? This is Ari from SCE. Can you go back to
Sure.
the last slide?
Go ahead.
There was a next step that we've been wondering about, and that's listed here, the last bullet point. You mentioned the decision to direct the implementation. So that's referenced in the original, I think we had a scope of dates that we've talked about in the past. I'm curious, in terms of the timing, just in, with context of other resolutions and decisions that we've been waiting on in IDR, I want to know if Energy Division believes that this Commission decision directing implementation will come, say, before September 2026. I see we have a date of Q1 2026 for stakeholder comments. Is it anticipated that that decision would be, say, Q2 or maybe early Q3? Just because we've been discussing internally, well, when are we going to be required to implement this, and will it be in time for, say, the 2026-27 DPEP? So I'm just curious if you've internally discussed this, or if you can just kind of consider that issue as you do move forward to scheduling this out in the coming year.
Yeah, certainly the DPEP cycle will be, the dates will be considered when we start planning for this decision to be issued. So far, we have not yet developed or an established schedule that we can share. But again, we will be sharing this information as soon as we have it, and of course the yearly processes will be considered for when the decision is written as well. And yeah, I don't know, Gabe, if you have a comment on this question.
No, I think you covered it. I mean, certainly the timing to be timely for the next proximate planning cycle is a major consideration. So, there's no guarantee, but that would certainly be a goal of the commission.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, please, if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me at this email. And thank you again for joining us. And this workshop is now adjourned. Thanks.